Thanks a lot. Good evening, everybody. Thanks a lot, Joel, for this very kind and nice introduction. Thanks to the organizers, Sunil, Muhammad, and Joel, for inviting me, for having me here. It's a great honor for me. It's a very interesting conference today. So after 12 hours, you have to still listen to me. I will try to be quick, or after 10 hours. This is a really rapidly emerging university. It's in a vivid city. I was really impressed. It's the first time for me being in Abu Dhabi, so congratulations. And it's a big honor for being here. As Joel said, I'm from Vienna. As you can see in the slide, at least in 2018, we were #1 in terms of livability. And it's something that I can only confirm that I spend a lot of time, as Joel mentioned, abroad, and I think it's a very nice city. So next time you're around, let me know. I'm trying to head the Center of Medical Physics and Biomedical Engineering. And the reason why I came back from the UK, where I had a very, very nice professor position, is we have about, it's now in the meantime 200 staff. And it's a very nice infrastructure, like at a technical university. But we are placed really here in this medical, in one of the largest university hospitals in Europe, which is a General Hospital of Vienna. It has 24,000 rooms and 800,000 square meters, and there's everything you need in there. And this is really brilliant for translational research, and this is what I'm really interested in. So we do a lot of basic research, and we try to translate it. And it's nothing better than applying this in humans. After going through cells and animals, because by the end, scientists are lonely, right? You sit in your lab and think this is great, but nobody's interested in that. So we heard it today, you have to really network and connect the right people. But I think when you as an electrical engineer develop something where a different professional like clinicians say, this is useful, I think this is very, very helpful. And the translation in the General Hospital of Vienna is very good. So we have a Center for Molecular Medicine there. We have a huge small animal imaging lab there. We have a lot of people developing organoids. And we have also different comprehensive centers. And then we have the patients. So we have really the whole circle from molecular, from cells to small animals to organoids and to patient. And as I said, this is really very nice. And I'm fully aware that this architecture of hospital is not really great. But the way I see it, each hospital has 2 eyes. And these 2 eyes can be seen from the top. So one is histopathology and one is radiology. And we try to somehow link these two with our optical imaging techniques that we do. So historically, we're very strong in optical imaging. And as Joel mentioned, Professor Fercher, who is here in the middle, this is a photo from 2016. In March 17, unfortunately died. He was really, from my point of view, together with Professor Fujimoto at MIT, the 2 inventors of OCT. And I learned a lot from him, and he's really, so I followed him, and he really left a lot of huge legacy. So we're historically doing OCT since 30 years. So I was the first master student, at least in Europe, in 1990 in low coherence interferometry and then in OCT. And for me, it was really, I consider myself as blessed to having started my master's thesis in a technique that is now really, I think, a success story. And it hasn't been. So in 91, I remember I gave my first talks in Germany, and people said, what are you doing? Nobody needs OCT, especially in ophthalmology, because with ultrasound, we anesthetize the eye anyway. We don't need a non-invasive technique. So it's good to see that nearly 30 years later, that this opinion has changed. So historically, we have been long enough to really also, benchmarking-wise, we're quite active in publishing. And this includes all our publication from our clinical collaborators in this nice clinical large hospital. So let me briefly tell you what we do. We do a broad spectrum of science. We do a lot of MRI with radiology, up to 7 Tesla since more than 10 years, with spectroscopy, functional MRI. We build our flexible, customized, personalized coils ourselves for 7 Tesla, which is very interesting also for spin-off. We have a lot of nuclear medicine, so PET-CT, PET-MRI, and AI-based algorithms for that. We do a lot of artificial heart. I heard a lot of very interesting 3D printing, tissue engineering talks today. So this is more than 30 years we do these artificial hearts, which in the beginning were more as a bridge until you get a donor, but now this is a competition between these 2 techniques. So this is really something very intensively. We also do a lot of rehabilitation engineering. You see here a mind control prosthesis. So once you lose your in this part of the hand, you get a prosthesis, and we get it interacted with a neural system again. This is very interesting. We do a functional electrostimulation with spinal cord for paralyzed people. And what's really interesting is, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a lot of interesting infrastructure like clean rooms, mechanical workshops, plastic labs, electrospinning labs that you normally have in a technical university. A technical university environment, but we have this in a hospital, and this is very nice. And we also have rapid prototyping. We recently got a lot of money, and we have pretty much all the different 3D printers from nano to biocompatible to plastic to glass to titanium. And this is really, really interesting. So let me do two things before I begin. First of all, I would like to thank those who really actually do the work. And this is the lab that, together with Rainer Leikep, you see him here, I'm heading. This is like 30 people, postdocs and PhDs. We're involved in 9 European projects in parallel at the moment, and this is really great because you can do a lot of interesting work. And most of the work that I will show from my lab today is done by these people. So having 45 minutes for telling you about OCT is a little bit like David against Goliath. So this is really a little bit challenging because in these 30 years, this field has been exploding. But I will try to do my best, and if you take a bit of an iceberg with you, then I'm more than happy. So I see this at the end of the day as some kind of an infotainment that you should see this as some kind of mixture of information and entertainment that will try to give you a little bit of crash course to the force of OCT. So this title of my talk is Seeing the Invisible, and I think it's really interesting because what I meant with this, you take an invisible phenomenon, if it's morphology, if it's anatomy, or if it's function, and you turn it into a visible picture, like you see here in the Schlieren photography. But it's really interesting because what I will show you today is we very often use invisible electromagnetic waves to make this invisible phenomenon visible. So I think it's an interesting way when you think about imaging. When you type in Google medical imaging, this is what you get. So it's this typical clinical imaging that we all use, from X-ray to CT to ultrasound, MRI. And it's really interesting because when you talk to someone on the street, when you talk about clinical imaging, they speak about these techniques. When you look at the global market, and when you believe these things, it is very different. So 2/3 of the market make up optical imaging. So 64% of the imaging, the global imaging market, at least in the US, are made up by optical imaging, and only roughly a little bit more than 1/3 is really this well-known clinical imaging, is radiological imaging. And it's mainly because of the scopes we heard today. It's not only the microscopes, it's the endoscopes, the cystoscopes, the laparoscopes. It's all these scopes that really have a big contribution to this optical market. So the take-home message here is clinical imaging is a lot of optical clinical imaging. Yes, it's well known that there's CT and ultrasound and X-ray, and these are very often used, but from a market point of view, from the instrument point of view, it's really a dominant role of optical imaging. Just as a comparison, the rapidly growing mobile and home health market is also catching up here. So when you also look at how important is optical imaging, when you go through all the list of the different type of clinicians, you realize that the majority uses also optical imaging. So it is interesting because, yes, MRI and CT is important, but these are expensive machines. They're not too often available. So it's really the take-home message here is that optical imaging is a little bit of a not properly recognized technique in a clinician. So coming back to how we do clinical imaging in general, and you see here from left to right, we go from dangerous to completely less dangerous radiation. So here is really the nuclear medicine area with gamma and X-rays, and then here there's this MRI, which is completely without any problems except the magnetic field that changes. But in between there's optical imaging, and this yellow curve is attenuation, so how much the light is absorbed or scattered. I mean, you see here the least absorption is really in this small window of optical imaging. So it's really the big advantage of optical imaging is very high resolution, and due to this attenuation curve, it's really perfect for any kind of molecular information. So optical imaging is really very good in resolution and getting molecular information. And when you also look, when you turn this by 90 degrees, you see here that here on the top is the less dangerous, and here the higher frequency, the more energy. So you see here these different well-known techniques. They cover certain parts, right? MRI is quite good from full body to kind of microscope. But when you look at the optical imaging, except the full body, which is here at the end, it covers pretty much all the ranges, from cells, even from lipids, from subcellular stuff to organs. So this is another important take-home message. You can send the light through fibers to the internal organs, and also can access internal organs, because you cannot access them from outside. So this is really something very, very important to take with you. So in principle, it's interesting when you look at all these techniques, it's really the microscopy part that can then be miniaturized and then access the organs in any way. And there's no instrument, no technique, if it's optical or non-optical, that covers more than 2 orders of resolution scales. And that's something that's interesting. So you need multimodality if you want to look at different aspects in your diagnosis. So this is the reason why, especially the last 10 years, my lab has really focused on multimodality imaging. So when you look at the different light-tissue interactions that optical imaging enables, and on the right side you see here in green, you see all the organs that have been imaged with optical imaging, and red is here the therapy. But let's focus on the diagnosis. On the left you see it's mainly scattering, it's absorption used for spectroscopy and for the acoustic, and then it's nonlinear stuff for spectroscopy and it's fluorescence. So these are the 5 main light-tissue interaction from a physics point of view that make up the optical imaging. And then depending on the time scale you see on the back, the very short pulses are the nonlinear optical process, then there's the pulsed imaging, like a nanosecond is the photoacoustics I will talk about later, and then this milliseconds to seconds is where OCT takes place, right? And then there's this therapy. So it's really 4 different schemes that we're talking about. There's also an inherent connection between resolution and penetration. So as you can see here on the top, this smaller field of view, the smaller volumes that we scan have a very high resolution. But as soon as we go here to this larger object, the resolution obviously is less. So there's an inherent connection between penetration and resolution. And in all the optical techniques there are on the market, so roughly here that I showed here, you see here from super resolution up to diffuse optical tomography. We had a very nice talk of Andreas today. So you have this connection between penetration and resolution, and it's a fixed correlation here. And optical imaging offers you more than 4 orders of magnitude in terms of penetration and resolution ratio. This is really something very, very interesting, I think, from an imaging point of view. So in principle, you could categorize these optical imaging techniques, all that are existing, in three ones. One is the standard of care. So these are the ones established, and we all know the scopes one here. So laparoscope, endoscope, and it's very nice to see that there's OCT already involved, in addition to immunohistochemistry. Then there's some kind of intermediate. These are the ones that are in clinical adaptation. And then there's the ones that are really translational. These are really the ones that are tested at the moment. They're not FDA approved, not yet really in clinical daily routine. And I will very briefly cover these 3 areas, mainly from an OCT point of view. Will not cover the other techniques. So it's very nice to see that in all these 3 categories, and especially in the standard of care, and this is mainly OCT and ophthalmology, OCT is involved here. But it's interesting that there's a lot of others that my group also cover, and therefore I can cover a lot of these combined techniques too. So when we start with the standard of care, it's really, as I mentioned, in the late 80s, beginning of 1990, where OCT was really born. This is Professor Fujimori on your right, and you see here Professor Fercher on your left, and this was when I was a master student. So it really started, as you can see, in the end of 80s, and then it was really the seminal paper in Science 91, where also Joel Schumann is a co-author, that really gave birth to OCT. For those who haven't heard about OCT, I will show you a brief video explaining how it works as an example on the eye. So this is a typical commercial OCT system. The patient put his head on this chin rest here, and there's this very soft laser going into his eye, and goes through the iris into the eye. And this is the backside. The dark is the fovea, and then the white is the optic disc. And then you very softly raster scan, like in ultrasound. You get one-dimensional A scans. You raster scan over 2D and then over 3D, over volume, and you can really color code the intensity of the backscattered light. What you can then do is you can 2D and 3D map this tissue information or morphological information. This is a healthy retina, and it's not something that is just crazy being done in Austria. Every second on that planet, somebody gets a retinal, so an ophthalmic OCT exam by a commercial system. So this is really something that is quite established, and especially in ophthalmology, it helped a lot. And this is roughly the specs you can have. You can have 1 micron or even better nowadays. This has recently become significantly fast, so up to 600 million measurements per second. So 600 million one-dimensional ultrasound A scans, but in an optical way, non-invasively with much higher resolution. And there's a lot of contrast-enhanced functional and multimodal extensions of it. It's interesting when you look, this is a little bit of a busy slide, but when you, we'll walk you through it. This is the spatial resolution. You see MRI is roughly in the hundreds of micrometer and millimeter, and it can take a lot of voxels. And then there's these very high resolution microscopy techniques that are very high resolution, but they cannot really cover a lot of volume. These are photoacoustic ones and ultrasound ones that are very fast. And there's this empty space here, and this is really covered by OCT in terms of the resolution here in a 1 to 5 to 10 microns, and then in up to 500,000 cubic millimeter per second. So this is really a mesoscopic, so in the range of 1 to 10 micron, very fast imaging technique nowadays, with roughly up to 2 millimeter penetration depth, except the eye, where we can go to 25 millimeter of eye and then image the backside of the eye, the retina. The original idea of OCT was not ophthalmic imaging. The original idea was in this paper from Fujimoto, was to do optical biopsy. So instead of excising a tissue and preparing it for looking at it under the microscope, you want to have a laser beam, and like when you go to a supermarket, you have a barcode where you scan over it and you know how much it costs. So the idea was to quickly scan over a suspicious lesion, if it's on the surface of the body or inside, and quasi get the same information as you would get when you excise the tissue and look at it on the microscope. So it's like this histopathology that you've seen here. This is a cross-section of a tissue volume that you prepare for histology. We are not there yet in vivo, I think, after 30 years, and I'm wondering if we ever will be there, and I don't think OCT should replace histopathology. It will always be complementary to it. But this is the best, I think, that I've seen in terms of comparison to OCT. This is ex vivo. It's a so-called full-field OCT, but it doesn't matter. So you see on the top, this is the OCT of this histopathology. And don't forget, this is contrast-enhanced, and this is just OCT. So this is a very nice comparison showing you how close OCT is to histopathology. So it's really one of the fastest developed imaging techniques in the last half century. So you see an exponential increase of publication. There's a lot of companies now involved. This was a time when I did my master's, so I could have gone to SAIS and that's it. Now we can offer much more to our PhD students. We can go to a lot of companies, which is good, I think. And when you see this was in '98, which was already 7 years after the invention of OCT, and this was 2015. You see there's a huge activities all around the world, down to New Zealand, Australia. So this is really very nicely exploding. And I recently read a really interesting article, and this is what you see. This was the first X-ray image from 1896. And roughly more than 100 years later, you get this here. Now, the first glimpse you think, but it's not fair, because it's much lower dose, which is very good, and it's much faster, and it's very improved contrast. So I thought, okay, we can do the same in OCT, but not over 110 years, but only over, in this case, 20 years. And this is, in 20 years, we have 100 times higher resolution. We have 10 million times faster. There's a lot of extensions. So you can see that there's really an extremely rapid development. And that's what I said before. I think, especially in ophthalmology, it has really revolutionized the diagnosis. I think this is really something that made a huge impact, because you cannot take biopsies in the retina, and the optical methods were really limited by the frontal optics of the eye, by the lens and the cornea. So OCT had some special tricks to have a little bit of independence between axial and transresolution. In that sense, there's a lot of, up to 19 at the moment, commercial companies commercializing ophthalmic OCT. I don't think the market is large enough, but I'm surprised that in the last 20 years, most of them still exist. So as Joel mentioned, this was really, in the beginning of this millennium, I think it really took off because speed was improved and resolution was improved, and both could be improved or maintained. And this was what Joel mentioned before. This was the status of OCT up to the end of the last millennium. It's funny to see it now, 20 years later, but that's how it was. And you can see here a morphing sequence on the top where OCT is morphed into histopathology. Now it's histology, it has just been stretched a little bit, but it's morphed into OCT. So you can very nicely see the correspondence between these two. And that helped us really a lot. And it was a collaboration also with Jordan, with Jim Fujimoto, to establish the first time domain ultra-high res. So this, for those not familiar, when you look into the eye like this, you see a fundus photo. This is the fovea and the optic disc. And this dark region is the fovea, it is this foveal depression. This is a normal one. You can see that with this very nice resolution, you can clearly see which layer is affected. And this was really some kind of first in vivo optical biopsy of the retina back then, because you could clearly see which layer was affected. And then with the increase of speed, you can really put this in 3D, and it's some kind of optical analog to MRI and CT, but on a microscopic level. So you can really do this in 3D, and you can cut into it, you can look from a different point of view. This was really back then, I think, a big advantage. What's really great is this appeared like 2 years ago, I think. This shows the real impact of OCT. So $500 million in the US was involved in OCT research, and $1.5 billion was involved in clinicians and in a drug that is an anti-VEGF drug for a disease that is called age-related macular degeneration, which appears in elderly patients. And there was a 21-fold of return of government investment because OCT told the clinicians when to inject and how much. And this is really something that shows the impact of OCT. So this was an OCT-guided therapy of a disease that threatens the vision, the visual acuity, and there was a 21-fold so $9 billion was saved because it was OCT guided. So this is really, I think, something great. Whereas the future of ophthalmic OCT, with this higher, faster and faster speed, you can go to wider field of views. You can look at larger areas, properly visualized or sampled. This is also commercialized, so you can really see the natural curvature of the eye. Here, this is like 6 millimeters now scanning depth. So this is really something that's also commercially available. And you can also do 2D, you can do 4D. So this is 3D over time with 20 volumes per second. You see this jumping of, this is the fovea, and the patient fixates to different points. And this is really something that is very, very interesting because you now can have 3D over time, so we can have 4D visualization. This is very interesting for intraoperative, because this is also a very, very emerging field where you can, during surgery, get a 4D information, so 3D over time, especially how you maneuver your surgical tools and what you do to the retina. So I think this is really supported by this high-speed imaging. The high speed also helps to see cells in the retina. We use a technique from astronomy. Joel Schumann mentioned this today in the breakout session. So when you look at the distant star, the turbulence gives you an aberration, and you can correct this by a deformable mirror. And the same is done in the human eye. So for each investigated eye, you can correct aberrations to get a better spot, and then you see cells. And you can see them, these different spots are different cells in the retina. You can go up to 3D and also angiography-wise. I will speak about this a little bit later. So this is a typical cross-section where you see single in 2D, single photoreceptors. You can also see rods, or can also see cones. What's also helping in terms of speed, there's a functional extension of OCT that we initiated a long time ago. It's called optophysiology instead of electrophysiology, where we flash the retina and see how the retina reacts OCT-wise. And this is nowadays also possible with this very high speed or parallelization. You see there's a cross pattern projected on a cross pattern light flash projected on the retina, and this lighting up this black crosshair, it shows that there's an increase in the OCT signal we detect. So this is a very nice optical analog of electrophysiology, calling optophysiology. Obviously, I can't leave the stage without mentioning something about AI. I don't know, in the 90s we did deep learning and we had only 3 layers and less data, and now we have 3 million layers and gazillions of data. I think this is a very, very important, very potent technique. Caution is imperative though, because I go to conferences where people say, oh, you don't need 7 Tesla anymore. AI makes 7 Tesla out of every 3 Tesla image, so that's a little bit of you have to be very careful. But I think it's a very potent, this is a paper already mentioned today, I think, where there were 3 optometrists and 3 retinal specialists, and AI was diagnosing not worse, even a little bit better. So this is something that's coming in dermatology is already there. In radiology, they say in 5 years there will be no radiologists anymore. it is something that's coming from me. It's a little bit like Mexican food. I love Mexican food, but it's the same food, but differently wrapped up, right? So I think this whole AI, if it was called deep learning, it was called machine learning, now it's called AI. It's very potent because there's quantum computing coming up, there's supercomputing coming up. So I think this is a very potent technique, but you have to be very careful. So let's switch to the next region, which is clinical adaptation. So these are the ones that are close to becoming clinical standard. And there's a lot of internal organ imaging in OCT. So you see here an endoscope. In a guiding channel, you have this glass fiber that is inserted. And at the end, there's optics that guides the light by 90 degrees. And then this fiber is turned and pulled back. And in some kind of a helix form, as you can see here, this rotates and it's pulled back. With each rotation, you probe the inside of the organ, and you get this circumferential 2D information of morphology. So you get really very nice information about the circumferential scan here in depth up to 2 millimeter. So this is really like ultrasound, but with 2 orders or 1 to 2 orders better depth resolution. So this is really something that is very nicely used. It enables them to screen large areas. So in these large areas, you can really go up to centimeters. You can very nicely see that you can see here, this is normal area. And this is, you can see these white areas here, this is Barrett's esophagus. You can stretch them, unfold them out, and you can very nicely see this then in 3D. It's also done in cardiology. You see here again, you have this fiber, optical fiber, that at the end has some optics to divert the beam by 90 degrees. In a balloon, it's inflated again, it's rotated and pulled back. You see here the histology of these circumferential cross sections, and it's mainly used for placing stents. What you see here is a fly-through. This bluish one is the stent. The whitish one is calcium, and then there's lipid. So you can very nicely see the internal side of the vessel, and it's mainly used for checking this blue meshwork, which is the stent. And here on the right side, you can obviously see that there is an overgrowth of this stent. So you keep the stent, you use the stent to keep the vessel open so that you don't block it and get a heart attack. So this is mainly used for checking the stent and to check this overgrowth of the stent. And this is the 5th generation of commercial system. So you can very nicely see the placement of the stent. You can very nicely see if there's any overgrowth. So there's a little bit here, as you can see. It's also used in pulmonary medicine. You know that a lot of asthma and a lot of allergies are increasing because of the air pollution. You can very nicely see the air wall, and you can also see here any kind of different cancer stages. So there is, through the nose, a flexible endoscope that goes into the bronchi and images there. So this is really also very interesting. In urology, there is a forward imaging probe. So you go through the urinary tract and you image the bladder for cancer. This is very interesting too. This is even a functional one. So after transplantation of kidney, you not only get the morphology, you also get the functional, the blood, the vessel, the blood flow of the vessel. So this is really a very nice functional application of OCT. And this is an application of a needle. You can do this endoscope thin as an acupuncture needle. And you can investigate here the prostate. A very nice extension, we switch from morphology to some kind of a function is angiography. You see on the left a video, and here it's a summation, it's a differential contrast here. So whenever the blood cells move, you get a signal here. And this is really interesting because you can apply this to OCT. So you take 2 measurements at the same location, you compare these 2, when you're fast enough, the only thing that moved was the blood cells. You can use this contrast to have this label-free angiography. So these are all blood vessels in the retina with an avascular zone in the center, left eye and right eye, and with no offense to clinicians, this is a normal eye. It's obvious that there's something wrong here. So this is a very powerful extension of OCT, giving you perfusion information about the retina, giving you vasculature of the retina in 3D, and this is really, really very powerful. It's called OCT angiography. It's label-free. In former time, they injected a dye, and you had they took images from the fundus. So this is really very, very powerful. And it can also be used outside of the eye. We use this for angiogenesis, for cancer development, for cancerogenesis. So there's this idea that new vessels are built for the blood supply of the tumor. You can very nicely see here. You can investigate the vasculature when you apply some anti-VEGF drugs, so anti-cancer drugs. So you can very nicely, in addition to morphology, look at the perfusion of the tumor. This has been commercialized in the ophthalmic field. So for the eye, this is a standard now, and it's still in the learning curve. And with the high speed I mentioned before, you can not only look at small areas, but very large ones. And you don't forget, you have to be very fast because you image several times the same location. And over wide field, you need very high speed. So this is really also very nicely evolving. One other extension I would like to mention is, because in cancer, the biomechanics are very interesting. So OCT can also, because of phase-sensitive or speckle-sensitive detection, can indirectly measure the elastography, the biomechanics of the tissue. And you know that cancer cells get softer, but because of the collagen, the tissue appears more stiff. And this is really a very interesting area. This is all ex vivo, but also in the cornea and also in the skin, there have been already some in vivo measurements. So this is OCT used for measuring elastography. So you see this is very nice. There's also OCT measuring blood flow. But as I said, it's a broad spectrum, but I think this is really an emerging field and is very, very interesting, I think, for biomarkers. So let's switch to the last one, which I think is the most interesting one, because these are the more exotic ones. So this is work from us. We do with urology together. We have a forward imaging 3mm rigid cystoscope that we insert through the urinary tract into the bladder. And it has not only OCT to image the morphology. You see here, these are cross-sections from a volume. But it also has Raman. And Raman spectroscopy is a technique that is quite insensitive, but if you do it right, you can apply it in humans, and it gives you molecular information. And this is really great, because what you see down here is a molecular map of this bladder, and you see the different molecular maps. And what's really turning out that OCT with morphologic information can be now used for staging the cancer. And Raman spectroscopy gives you molecular information, can give you the grading. You see here low grade and high grade. So this is a perfect example of getting the best of both worlds. You have a very thin cystoscope. The OCT gives you morphology for staging, and Raman spectroscopy gives you this molecular map for grading. So this is really very, very nice. And I had to include this, at least for all the ophthalmologists here. This is normally not possible, not easily possible in the eye. We have here the first Raman measurements. So morphomolecular means you have morphologic information from OCT. You see here in the cross sections in 3D. And this is a molecular map of an excised retina with mimicking the numerical aperture of an eye, which is important because you cannot apply too much focusing in the eye because of the built-in optics. So this is mimicking the optics of a human eye with the power that is allowed on the retina, on an excised retina, and we get molecular imaging here in the retina. This is very exciting for us because it shows there's a distribution of the different molecules that we're looking here at, and there's even, we can see here, it's not the difference between red and black here, it's these little peaks on these two hills here, these here, that indicate different molecules here as compared to here. So this is really giving us, and we're close to doing this in vivo now, to do OCT for morphology and molecular imaging in the retina. And this is something I think this is very, very interesting. In terms of fluorescence, we also have a project with neurosurgeons. When you do surgery on the brain, especially with tumor, you want to save every cubic micrometer of healthy brain. And what you see here is that's what normally the clinician sees. And with our fluorescence lifetime imaging to combine with OCT, you can see the borders, you can see it here much better. You can see the borders here on the right side much better than on the left side. So this is what the normal clinician sees, and this is really the borders of the tumor. So combining OCT with fluorescence lifetime imaging, here it is mainly fluorescence lifetime imaging, you can really very nicely during operation, tell the clinicians where the borders of tumors are. And I think this is very interesting. Switching to photoacoustic imaging. In photoacoustic imaging, you listen to the sound of light. You send pulses into the tissue, and there's an ultrasound wave coming back. What it helps on the left side, this is a tumor in a mouse. So these are 2 millimeters of OCT, and you get several millimeters of vascularization. This is very interesting for angiogenesis. And these vessels are so nicely imaged that you can fly through them here on the right side. Has no clinical meaning, but it's part of a little bit of an infotainment. So this is really a very nice complementary. This is sensitive to scattering, and this is sensitive to absorption. And we use it in the clinics for skin at the moment. This is where you can see here, this is the 2 millimeter of skin morphology. Then you get OCT angiography, which is shown here. but you will see it here in a minute. So the OCT is now subtracted. This is OCT angiography, which gives you the smaller vessels, and then this is complemented by the larger vessels by photoacoustics. And this is very nice for basal cell carcinoma because it gives you exactly the dimensions of the tumor. So this is exactly the tumor visualization, or the visualization of the vessels. You can very nicely correlate this with histology of OCT and morphology of the histology. So this is really something that shows morphology, OCT angiography, and photoacoustics, and you can very nicely use this in clinics, at least in the skin. We have an ongoing project where we screen the esophagus with OCT and photoacoustics. You can see this is the size of a painkiller capsule. So this is 10 millimeters by, this is 15 by 7 millimeters, and has a very small fiber. So you send it down, it rotates, it images the morphology with OCT and some metabolic stuff with photoacoustics. And then after you swallow it, you have this small fiber coming out. You can speak, there's no sedation, you can drink water, and you pull it out again. It's a screening device in the size of a capsule with a micromotor in there, and there's OCT and photoacoustics in there. So this is really an ongoing project where it shows the multimodality of OCT and photoacoustics. We also use this in preclinical imaging. Here you see zebrafish, and you can also do oxygenation measurements very nicely with that. In terms of multimodality with OCT and multiphoton tomography is non-invasive optical microscopy, where you can see single cells. You see here single cells of the normal skin as you go deeper in depth. And you can see here, this is the basal cell carcinoma compared to the healthy one. You can see this is a healthy OCT 3D. This is the basal cell carcinoma already in morphology. Mesoscopic-wise, you see there's a difference. And you zoom in at the suspicious site, and you have here the subcellular resolution. So it's this see-zoom strategy. You see first some GPS here in 3D with OCT, and then you zoom in with multiphoton, and you get very nice information. You can also see the cross-sections that morphologically-wise in the basal cell carcinoma, something is wrong. And last but not least, we have a label-free non-linear optical microscopy. It's called undistorted Raman scattering, where you can very nicely pre-screen in OCT. This is a mouse ear, and you can zoom in and see the collagen, the elastin, and the lipids here in this area. So this is really something very nicely also to compare. Let me finish with something that I think fits very nicely to what I've partially also heard today. It's all about telemedicine. It's all about miniaturizing, getting low-cost screening devices. So why isn't there an OCT of that size? A handheld, portable one that can be imaged in the third world, in outpatients or at home. So this is something, when you look at your mobile, it's mainly a battery. Why? Because the electronics here is all miniaturized. In the same way as you can miniaturize electronics, you can also miniaturize photonics. So this is really something that kind of a little bit closes the loop of what we've heard in the morning. So the miniaturization of electronics is well established and it's very cheap, and therefore, once again, our mobiles are mainly batteries. But you can also miniaturize photonics. It's called photonic integrated circuits. And we had a very nice talk this morning about these integrated circuits. So what's happening there is a little bit like Lego. It sounds strange, but you build your different blocks and then you put it together on a breadboard. And what you do mainly is you restrict the light in waveguides. You do a special growing mechanism on a chip, and you can really build your OCT on a chip. And not only you can do and this is how it looks like with visible light. Here you see a beam splitter coming from the left, splitting into two and then splitting into further ones. So this is really how a chip looks like when the light goes through, if it's lossy. And you see the light coming out of the chip. So this is a photonic integrated circuit. You can now not only do optics, but you can miniaturize optics, miniaturize electronics, and put both, hybrid or not, on a chip. So you can have everything you need from an optics point of view, from a detector, transimpedance amplifier, data acquisition point of view, you can put everything on a chip. I think that is really something very, very interesting. I started 10 years ago with that. And this was the first European project we had. And this is a commercial product that shows a triple modality. This is a clinical photo. This is, hopefully you can see this. This is a digital dermatoscope, and this is a OCT cross-section. And the OCT system is 1 by 19 millimeter. It's a very small chip that's in this handheld probe. So it was the first, it was the easiest, fair enough, because you can apply a lot of power on the skin and you can put it on the skin and it's quite stable. That was the first approach we've done. But I also have two ongoing projects where we want to do this in ophthalmology. So the idea really is, instead of this, fair enough, not newest, but tabletop system, you put several chips, and this whole chip costs 5,000. So if there are hundreds or even thousands of chips, you can imagine how much a chip would cost. So these are two approaches we have. We have a spectral domain. This is a different technique in swept source. What I like to alert you here, this small thing here, this small magenta thing, is the OCT on a chip, compared to a 1-cent coin. So this is all the OCT. The reason why it's larger is we all know we have very thin laptops nowadays, but we carry a lot of adapters with us. Why? Because the connectors are still not small enough. You see, this connector detecting all the stuff needs some kind of size. So this is really the OCT chip. So it can be really small. Just to show you how this looks in the lab. So this is really the OCT chip. So it's 5 by 15 millimeters or so. So this is really small. So these are first results we started with. So these are in vivo results from in vivo human. This was very first image, like half a year ago, 400 times averaged. This is already only 100 times average. You see already cells here, which gave us a very good indication. You know, imaging the eye, I have to say, is really a challenge. You're not allowed to apply a lot of power. There's barely any photons coming back. It moves all the time. It doesn't fixate. The tear film dries out. So imaging a retina with an OCT on a chip was really, for me, a first landmark that it works. And this is what we recently got. No averaging here. So this is with an OCT on a chip. This is spectral domain. You see here different speeds, 20 to 67 kilohertz, different resolutions. But you can see very nicely even OCT angiography. This is done with a spectral domain OCT on a chip at 800 nanometers. This is the optic disc, just for Joel, so that he can see that only optic disc can be imaged. So this is really something that is quite comparable to a size 0. So this is an overlay. These greenish boxes are from our OCT on a chip. You see there is still, we have to improve signal to noise a little bit, but for a screening device, we're already approaching the, performance that is really, I think, very promising. So in that sense, I think what I have to say is this is much smaller, much cheaper, and much faster also, because you can put a lot of tricks on a chip to make it much faster. So to finish, I think OCT is a self-accelerating cycle. There's a lot of technological innovations I showed you. There's not only AI, there's miniaturization, there's new lasers, there's GPU, supercomputing. There's a lot of interesting stuff that make up this technology innovations. There's new emerging applications where we can apply it to. And there's more research needed to close this. And this is really fed by the increasing prevalence of certain diseases. It's like leukemia or air pollution and therefore the bronchi. And there's the affordability that also feeds in here. So we heard very often today that in certain areas OCT is still too expensive, and hopefully the miniaturization will help on that. So in that sense, I think OCT is at the moment a huge fun technology to work with. It's great to combine it with other techniques. I was trying to show not only on a microscope level, but also in an endoscope down to needle level. I think it's interesting because you can miniaturize it with photonic integrated circuits, which make it probably really handheld OCT, make it cheaper and really maintenance-free. And you can really use it in the outpatients and also in the third world. And you can really address new markets, I think. And you can at one point swallow OCT, and it's so cheap that you don't care what's happening afterwards, and if you don't get it back. So that's, I think, is really something very interesting. And I think there is a lot of other techniques feeding in, like AI and adaptive optics. And so in that sense, I think it's great to work in this field. And I hope I showed you a little bit of a translation, what we do and what other groups do. And I think this has very great potential to keep us busy for the next decade. Thank you very much.